The sea was calm enough to ignore, not peaceful, not dangerous, just familiar. For the crew, this voyage was routine, another crossing that never demanded attention. The ship was built for work, not for stories. Steel corridors, heavy cargo, nothing unusual. That was why no one felt fear. Below deck, a crewman moved through the interior, listening to the steady hum of the engines and the sound of water against metal. These sounds meant stability. But far above, the ocean was already changing. The balance was closer than anyone realized. By the time the first warning appeared, it was already too late. The first warning came as a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first. A crate rolled slightly, a door rattled in its frame, and the hum of the engine seemed to shiver for a moment. The crew below deck glanced at one another, shrugged, and continued their tasks. Ships like this groaned and shifted all the time. This was part of the rhythm, part of life at sea. Yet something in the air made even the seasoned sailor pause. A tension too thin to explain, like the moment right before thunder cracks across the sky. Then the tilt came, a violent roll that knocked the unprepared to the floor. The lights flickered, and the ship's steel frame groaned loudly, protesting under stress it had endured countless times before. Water began seeping in through small cracks and seams. Nothing dramatic yet, but enough to make the air smell of salt and oil in a way that felt wrong. Panic had not yet set in. There was only the realization that the ship was no longer completely under control. The crew scrambled to secure cargo, to stabilize equipment, to brace themselves, but each effort seemed to meet with futility. Every action caused the vessel to shift again, unpredictable and heavy, as though the ocean itself were testing their resolve. Below deck, the trapped crewman felt the first real surge of fear. He had spent years at sea, surviving storms that would have terrified inexperienced sailors. But this was different. The metal walls were groaning in ways he had never heard. The hum of engines had changed, becoming erratic and uneven, like a heartbeat that was struggling. He moved quickly to the nearest hatch, hoping to find higher ground, a place where he could reassess. But the passageways were slick, narrow, and already filling with water that had found its way in through hidden cracks. Every step became more difficult. Every movement sent water rushing, echoing through the ship, turning the confined metal corridors into something alive, something hostile. Suddenly, the world shifted entirely. A violent roll sent him crashing into a support beam, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. He gasped, and the water poured into his lungs for a moment before he realized he was still upright, or at least what counted as upright in a ship that had begun to tip violently. The floor beneath him seemed to dissolve, merging with the wall. The ceiling came down to meet his head. The lights flickered and then died, plunging everything into darkness so complete it was almost physical. The only sound was the rushing water, the groaning metal, and his own panicked breathing echoing in the void. Other crew members shouted, tried to find each other, but the chaos swallowed their words. Doors slammed, cargo shifted, and steel collided against steel. For those few who managed to make it to a ladder or a hatch, escape was still possible, but only if they could navigate the maze of the collapsing vessel. For him, the path had already been cut off. He was thrown into a smaller compartment as the ship tilted again, and the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening clang. Water was rising fast now, cold and heavy, pressing against his chest and limbs. Panic surged, but he forced himself to focus. Every breath had to be controlled, every movement deliberate. In the chaos, he realized he had become trapped in a pocket, small but enough for him to breathe, for now. Minutes passed like hours. The water continued to rise in other sections of the ship, submerging those corridors he had briefly glimpsed before. Above him, the ceiling pressed closer. The air was thinning. His heartbeat, once steady and reliable, became erratic. He could feel the oxygen level dropping, could almost taste the thickening carbon dioxide in the pocket. Cold crept into his body, first as a chill along his limbs, then seeping into his chest, into his core. Every shiver burned energy, yet staying still risked wasting the oxygen faster than panic would. The mind, starved of stimulus, began to fill the silence with its own creations. At first, it was small sounds, the echo of footsteps, the whisper of voices that weren't there. Then shapes appeared in the darkness, fleeting and impossible. He whispered to them, tried to call for help, and felt foolish when there was no answer. Alone, trapped, he realized that survival might come not from action, but from patience, from the almost unbearable discipline of holding still and conserving what little he had. The hours stretched into an eternity where every second felt doubled, where the passage of time was irrelevant, and all that mattered was keeping the air alive in his lungs. Cold continued to dominate. Muscles stiffened, fingers lost sensation. Lips and extremities began to tingle from frostbite. Yet his brain, somehow, refused to succumb. Hypothermia slowed his metabolism, reducing oxygen demand. The very thing that threatened to kill him was paradoxically keeping him alive. Consciousness became a delicate balance, a dance between staying alert and conserving energy. Every minor adjustment, every breath, was critical. The corridor around him was impossible to navigate in the darkness. Every attempt to swim or climb could mean drowning instantly. So, he waited, silent, still, listening to the rhythm of water dripping, to the faint creaks of the ship adjusting under pressure, to his own heartbeat that had become unnervingly loud in the quiet void. He remembered everything about the ship before disaster. The smell of oil, the warmth of the engine room, the chatter of crew members, the mundane routines that had seemed unremarkable. Now, all that was gone, replaced by darkness and water, by uncertainty, and the looming presence of death. Every thought was sharpened by the fear that rescue might never come. Hours turned into a blur. He counted his breaths when he could, measured the rising and falling of his chest, tried to mark time, but the world had lost all structure. It was a waiting game, a test of endurance that was absolute in its severity. Time had no meaning. The minutes blurred into one another, each second stretching into eternity. He could feel the air thinning with every breath, the carbon dioxide thickening, pressing down on his lungs like invisible weights. Cold had seeped into every muscle, every joint, and yet he dared not move too much. Panic would burn precious oxygen faster than staying still. He clung to the thin pocket of air like it was a lifeline, knowing that even the smallest miscalculation could end everything. His mind, desperate for any distraction, began to play tricks. Shapes formed in the darkness, faces of colleagues who had vanished, shadows that seemed to move on their own, the fleeting impression of hands reaching out. He whispered, calling for them, but silence swallowed his voice. The isolation pressed against his skull, suffocating not with water, but with fear and despair. He realized that death would come not from drowning immediately, but from waiting, from being forgotten beneath tons of metal and sea. The cold crept deeper. Fingers and toes were numb. His lips tingled. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, yet his brain refused to give in. Hypothermia slowed his metabolism just enough to extend the precious minutes he had left. Every breath was a gamble, each inhalation bringing him closer to suffocating, yet not breathing meant certain death. He measured his own heartbeats, trying to find rhythm in chaos. He tried to focus on the sounds, the slow drip of water, the distant groan of metal, the irregular slap of waves against the hull, but nothing gave comfort. Each noise could be the ship shifting, a door collapsing, or water finally breaking into his compartment. For hours he remained still, suppressing the instinct to move, to struggle, to scream. He remembered snippets of life from before, the smell of coffee brewing in the galley, the laughter of fellow sailors, the rhythm of daily routines. Now those memories were cruel reminders of the world that existed above, beyond the steel walls and water, a world he might never return to. He spoke aloud sometimes, reciting fragments of conversations, prayers, random facts, anything to keep his mind tethered to reality. Silence was deadly. It made fear tangible, almost physical. Occasionally, he dared to look upward into the air pocket, counting the shallow space above him. It seemed impossibly thin, but it was enough. For now. The water around him was icy, pressing against his chest, making every movement an ordeal. Every instinct to try to climb, to swim, to escape, was overridden by the knowledge that such action would consume oxygen and energy too quickly. He had to wait. The waiting was agony, yet it was life itself. As time dragged on, hallucinations intensified. He imagined footsteps in the corridors, distant voices calling his name, lights flickering in corners that did not exist. His mind filled the void with whatever it could conjure, a cruel mimicry of hope. At moments, he imagined a hand reaching down into the water, a diver pulling him out. He wanted to move, to reach for it. but he restrained himself. Movement could mean drowning, could mean the loss of the thin air sustaining him. He had to hold on, each breath measured, each heartbeat precious. Hours stretched, hypothermia deepened, slowing his thoughts and movements. Time seemed endless, a cycle of fear, breath, cold, and silence. He began to drift in consciousness, slipping between clarity and the edges of unconsciousness. Memories, both distant and recent, floated through his mind like debris in water. He remembered his family, trivial conversations, unfinished tasks, moments of laughter. Each memory was bittersweet, a reminder of the life above and the precarious line between existence and death below. Days had passed, though he could not measure them. Time had no meaning in the darkness, only the rise and fall of his own chest, the slow drip of water, and the faint creak of steel reminded him he was still alive. His body had begun to betray him, limbs stiff, teeth chattering, lungs burning, but still somehow he clung to consciousness. Every breath was precious, every heartbeat a small victory. Above the wreck, the salvage operation was underway. Divers did not expect life. After hours of scanning, probing, and careful mapping, they assumed the compartments held nothing but debris and bodies. Each dive was routine, methodical, controlled. Yet the sea is never predictable, and in one dark corridor, a beam of light caught something moving. At first, the diver thought his eyes deceived him. The water carried strange shadows, twisting shapes, floating debris. But then he saw it again, a hand rising slowly, reaching into the beam of his flashlight. The movement was deliberate, human. Panic surged through him, a visceral shock that froze his limbs for a second. The diver had trained for emergencies, for death, for disaster, but never for life appearing where none should exist. The realization hit both men at once. He was alive. Against every calculation, against every prediction, against all odds, he had survived. The diver shouted into his comms, the sound distorted by water, adrenaline driving the urgency. Every movement had to be precise. One wrong turn could crush him against debris or cause a surge that would end the life that had already defied death. Extraction was painstaking. The diver could not simply ascend. The pressure change would be fatal. They had to navigate narrow passageways, through partially flooded corridors, around twisted metal and floating cargo. Every inch required delicate maneuvering. The trapped man, barely conscious, followed as best he could, guided by the diver's hand and voice. Every second was a gamble, every movement critical. The pocket of air that had kept him alive was gone in some sections, replaced by icy water that threatened to drag him into unconsciousness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity underwater, they reached open water. Sunlight fractured through the surface, a world he had not seen in over 60 hours. His body gave up in relief and exhaustion, collapsing into the diver's arms. He was alive, but only barely. His lungs, strained by limited oxygen, ached violently. His body shivered uncontrollably, a thin shell battered by hypothermia and fear. Yet, he was alive, breathing air that was no longer trapped, feeling the warmth of a sun he had almost forgotten existed. Above him, rescuers pulled him from the water. Medics worked quickly, checking vitals, warming his body, ensuring that this miracle of survival did not end moments after it began. He was conscious enough to realize that the ordeal was over, yet the shadow of the darkness, of the waiting, of the near-death experience lingered in his mind. He would never forget the silence, the cold, the pressure, or the moments when he truly believed no one would come. Survival, he later reflected, had not come from strength or skill alone. It had come from patience, from restraint, from the impossible balance between fighting and waiting, and luck. Unquestionable, inexplicable luck. The ocean had claimed most of the ship and its crew, but somehow it had spared him. As he was lifted onto the deck of the rescue vessel, gasping, shivering, and exhausted, the sun felt unreal. The air, heavy with salt and wind, seemed almost alien. He had survived what no calculation, no training, and no expectation would have predicted. And yet, beneath him, the wreck remained, silent and indifferent, a reminder of the fragile boundary between life and death. The ocean does not care. It does not negotiate. It does not forgive. And it does not remember those who survive. It only remembers what it has taken. And for 60 hours, he had danced on that edge, alone in darkness, with nothing but a thin pocket of air and the stubborn, fragile persistence of life itself.